Hey everyone, and welcome back. You sent in some really interesting stuff about this whole fake news thing.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a deep dive into that today. And I think a pretty good way to illustrate some of the challenges around this is to look at this pretty heated exchange that happened on CNN between Don Lemon and Mark Dice.
Okay.
Mark
Yeah.
Dice, right? Conservative commentator, very skeptical of CNN.
Yes. He provides a great example, I think, of how tricky it is to sort of navigate, the information landscape these days and how easily that term fake news is thrown around.
Yeah, and this clip I think really kind of got under Don Lemon's skin a little bit. The segment starts off innocently enough. Lemon's talking about the cost of Secret Service protection for Trump's children. And, before he can even really get into it, Mark Dice jumps in and just calls it fake news.
Well, it really kind of highlights the first challenge we have when we're dealing with this topic, right?
Yeah.
The term fake news itself is so slippery. It's often used as this kind of catch-all term for anything from, outright fabricated stories to reporting that someone just happens to disagree with.
Right. So if everything is fake news, then is anything fake news?
Right.
We need like some kind of scale or spectrum or something, right, to differentiate between, you know, I don't know, a story about a politician being a lizard person
Yeah.
and a news report that maybe has a slight bias
Yeah.
or, presents a certain perspective.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
so it can be helpful, I think, to think of fake news on a spectrum.
Okay.
So on one end of the spectrum, you have totally fabricated information
Hmm.
created intentionally to deceive.
Right.
So, those things you see on social media sometimes, these outlandish headlines that are just designed to go viral.
Yeah.
And then on the other end, you have bias reporting,
Okay.
where an outlet might be selectively choosing facts or, framing a story in a way that favors a particular viewpoint.
Right. So it's not always black and white. There's shades of gray depending on the intent and the degree to which the information is manipulated or distorted.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then there's everything in between, right? Like satire sites that are meant to be funny, but some people might take them seriously.
Exactly. And that's where, this idea of critical thinking comes in, right? We
Yeah.
can't just, accept or reject information at face value. We have to develop the skills to really analyze what we're encountering.
Yeah.
Look at the source, look for evidence, and assess the overall credibility of what we're reading or watching.
Which brings us back to this CNN clash. Don Lemon kind of understandably wanted Mark Dice to explain what he meant by fake news. And Dice's response was to bring up all this past reporting from CNN that he felt was misleading or biased.
And that's where we get into the really, kind of nitty-gritty work of trying to unpack those specific claims
Okay.
and see, do they meet the criteria for fake news? Is it bias or is it just, a difference of opinion?
Okay, let's get into some of those examples then, because Dice brought up some pretty serious accusations, like CNN allegedly censoring reports about Saddam Hussein's atrocities in Iraq.
Claims that they downplayed negative coverage of Bahrain, and even a story about Nancy Sinatra not performing My Way at Trump's inauguration, which he claims was false.
Yeah, those are some pretty weighty examples.
Yeah.
And they illustrate why it's so important to carefully examine each claim rather than just, accepting it at face value.
Yeah.
So, in the case of the Hussein allegations, we would really need to look at what specific information was CNN supposedly censoring?
Right.
Were other outlets reporting on these atrocities?
Right.
If so, was CNN's coverage significantly different?
Yeah.
Or maybe they chose to focus on, other aspects of the Iraq War, which wouldn't necessarily be censorship, just maybe an editorial decision about what to prioritize.
So even if they weren't reporting on those specific atrocities, it doesn't automatically mean that they were deliberately suppressing information. It could be that they just had a different editorial focus.
Exactly. And that's an important distinction to keep in mind whenever we're evaluating, any news coverage. Every outlet has to make choices about, what stories to cover, how much emphasis to give them, what angle to take. And those decisions are influenced by a lot of different factors like, their overall editorial slant,
Sure.
their target audience, and even, logistical limitations.
That makes sense. Now, what about this Bahrain allegation? This one seemed particularly charged, like suggesting that CNN might have been influenced by political or economic interests.
Yeah, that's a valid concern. And I think, when we're evaluating news coverage, it's always worth considering who might be benefiting from a particular narrative.
Right.
So in case of Bahrain, we could look into whether CNN has any financial ties to the Bahraini government or businesses
Mm-hmm.
that might be influencing their reporting.
Right.
We could compare their coverage to that of other outlets
Yeah.
to see if there are any, significant discrepancies or omissions.
So it's about looking for potential conflicts of interest and Comparing different sources to see if there are any red flags that might suggest bias or a lack of objectivity.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to uncover those things.
Yeah.
Media ownership can be complex
Yeah.
and biases can be subtle, but by just being aware of these potential influences, we can be, I think, more critical consumers of information.
Let's move on to this Nancy Sinatra story. Now, this one seems a bit less consequential than the other two, but it still raises questions about, accuracy in reporting.
Yeah, even seemingly minor factual errors can erode trust in a news source. And this is where a technique called lateral reading can be really helpful.
Lateral reading, what's that?
It basically means opening up multiple tabs in your browser and comparing information from different sources.
Okay.
So in this case, if you're curious about the Sinatra story, you could do a quick search
Right.
for other reports about the Trump inauguration playlist.
Yeah.
See if they corroborate CNN's version of events. And if you find conflicting information, you can then dig a little deeper to see, which source seems more credible.
So it's like fact-checking in real time.
Exactly. And it's a really good habit to get into whenever you encounter information that, seems questionable or when you're dealing with a topic that's particularly controversial.
Now, what about Jeff Zucker's alleged statement about CNN's credibility? I can see how that would be a point of contention.
Yeah, that example, I think, raises an important point about, how subjective credibility is.
Mm-hmm.
What one person considers a highly credible source, another might view with a lot of skepticism.
Right.
Our perceptions of media outlets are often shaped by our own, pre-existing beliefs and political leanings.
So it's not just about whether a news outlet is factually accurate. It's also about whether their overall perspective aligns with our own.
Yes, and this is where it becomes really crucial to step outside of our own echo chambers and expose ourselves to a diversity of viewpoints.
That makes sense. If we only consume news that reinforces our existing beliefs, we're not really getting a complete picture of the world.
Exactly. And it's easy to fall into that trap, especially, with the way social media algorithms work these days.
Mm.
They tend to feed us more of what we already agree with, which can really create a distorted view of reality.
Speaking of which, let's talk about Don Lemon's comment about buying an automatic weapon, which Mark Dice challenged based on his personal anecdote.
Yeah.
This seems like a tricky one because it's not really about factual accuracy, but rather, personal experience versus a broader claim.
Yeah, you're right. It highlights, I think, the difference between anecdotal evidence and statistical data.
Right.
So just because one person has a certain experience,
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily mean it's representative of a larger trend or, the norm.
So while personal stories can be compelling and add a human dimension to an issue, we shouldn't rely on them to draw conclusions about complex topics.
Absolutely. I think in this case, Lemon may have been referencing statistics or reports that suggest that, it is relatively easy to obtain automatic weapons in certain areas,
Right.
whereas Dice might have had a very different experience based on his own circumstances.
So we have to be careful about generalizing from individual experiences.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And this is why it's, so important to consider the full range of evidence and perspectives when we're evaluating any claim or argument.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of critical thinking. But what does that actually look like in practice? What are some specific steps that our listeners can take to become more discerning news consumers?
I think with this Hussein thing, it's really tough for us to know for sure without access to, internal documents and things like that.
Right. We can't just take Mark Dice's word for it. But I guess what are the questions we should be asking to evaluate this claim?
Well, I think, first of all, we should consider what else was being reported at the time. Were other news outlets covering these atrocities?
Right.
If so, was CNN's coverage, significantly different?
Right.
Maybe they chose to focus on other aspects of the Iraq War, which wouldn't necessarily be censorship,
Yeah.
just maybe an editorial choice about what to prioritize.
So even if they weren't reporting on those specific atrocities, it doesn't mean they were deliberately trying to, hide anything.
Right.
It could just be that they were focusing on something else.
Exactly. And that's an important distinction, I think, to keep in mind when we're evaluating any news coverage.
Yeah.
Every outlet has to make choices about, what stories to cover, how much emphasis to give them, what angle to take.
Mm-hmm.
And, those decisions are influenced by a lot of different factors.
Sure.
Like, their overall editorial slant, their target audience, even logistical limitations.
Mm. Okay, that makes sense. What about this Bahrain thing?
Yeah.
That one seemed particularly charged, the idea that they might be influenced by political or economic interests.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. I think when we're evaluating news coverage, it's always worth considering, who might be benefiting from a particular narrative.
Right.
So in the case of Bahrain, we could look into whether CNN has any financial ties to the Bahraini government,
Right.
businesses that might be influencing their reporting.
Right.
We could compare their coverage to that of other outlets to see if there are any significant discrepancies or omissions.
So looking for conflicts of interest, basically, and then comparing different sources to see if there's anything that stands out.
Exactly. And, it's not always easy to uncover these things.
Yeah.
Media ownership can be very complex, and, biases can be pretty subtle.
Right.
But just by being aware of these potential influences, we can be more critical consumers of information.
All right, let's move on to this Nancy Sinatra story,
Okay.
which, maybe a little less important than the others, but still raises questions about accuracy in reporting.
Yeah, even seemingly minor factual errors can erode trust in a news source. And this is where a technique called lateral reading can be really helpful.
Lateral reading? I've never
Yeah.
heard of that.
It basically just means opening up multiple tabs in your browser and comparing information from different sources.
Okay.
So in this case, if you were curious about the Sinatra story, you could do a quick search. For other reports about the Trump inauguration playlist,
Right.
see if they corroborate CNN's version of events. And if you find conflicting information, then you can dig a little deeper to see which source seems more credible.
So it's like real-time fact-checking.
Exactly. And it's a good habit to get into whenever you encounter information that seems, questionable,
Right.
or when you're dealing with a topic that's particularly controversial.
What about this thing with Jeff Zucker and this statement he allegedly made about CNN's credibility?
Yeah, I think that example raises an important point about just how subjective credibility is.
Okay.
What one person considers a highly credible source, another person might view with a lot of skepticism.
Yeah, sure.
Our perceptions of media outlets are often shaped by, our own pre-existing beliefs and political leanings.
So it's not just about whether they're accurate, but whether you agree with their perspective.
Right, and that's why it's so important to step outside of our own echo chambers and expose ourselves to a diversity of viewpoints.
Yeah, makes sense. If we only consume news that reinforces what we already believe, then we're not really getting the full picture.
Exactly, and it's really easy to fall into that trap, especially, with the way that social media algorithms work these days.
Right.
They tend to just feed us more of what we already agree with, which can really create a distorted view of reality.
Okay, so speaking of which, this thing with Don Lemon and the automatic weapon, and Mark Dice was challenging that from his own personal experience. It seems like a tricky one because it's not really about fake news. It's more about, is one person's experience, more valid than a broader claim?
Yeah, I think you're right. This highlights the difference between anecdotal evidence and, statistical data.
Right.
So just because one person has a certain experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's representative of a larger trend or the norm.
So we should be careful about, using one person's story to try to prove a point about something that affects a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think in this case, Lemon might have been referencing, statistics or reports that suggest that it is relatively easy to obtain automatic weapons in certain areas.
Right.
Whereas Dice might have had a very different experience based on, his own circumstances.
So two different realities, basically.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to consider the full range of evidence and perspectives when we're evaluating, any claim or argument.
It seems like we keep coming back to this idea of critical thinking, but what does that look like? On a day-to-day basis, what can people do to be more discerning news consumers? It seems like we've done a lot of debunking and fact-checking, which is important.
Yeah.
But I'm curious about the more proactive steps.
Right.
What can we do to actually be informed rather than just critical?
That's a great question. And it gets to the heart of, why we're doing this.
Yeah.
It's not enough to just tear down information.
Right.
We also have to build up our understanding of the world.
So where do we even begin? Because it can feel pretty overwhelming.
Yeah.
With just the amount of information that's coming at us from all sides.
Well, I think a good starting point is to just recognize that we all have biases. We all come to every piece of news, with our own set of preconceived notions and beliefs, and those can really unconsciously shape how we interpret information.
So step one is admitting that, we're not these blank slates.
Right.
We all have these filters and we need to be aware of them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Once we're aware of our own biases, we can start to challenge them. And a great way to do that is by actively seeking out diverse perspectives.
Okay.
So, don't just stick to the news sources that you already agree with.
Right.
Make an effort to read or watch news from outlets that have different viewpoints, even those you might initially disagree with.
It's like trying different foods. You
Yeah,
might find something you really like that you never would have tried before.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
And it's not about forcing yourself to agree with everything you read or hear.
Right.
It's just about expanding your understanding of the world
Yeah.
and seeing issues from multiple angles.
So instead of just, going into our own little echo chambers, we should be branching out and looking at all these different perspectives, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
Exactly. And, it's not just about seeking out different viewpoints.
Right.
It's about engaging with that information critically.
Okay.
So don't just passively absorb what you're reading or watching. Ask yourself questions like, who wrote this?
Yeah.
What's their background?
Right.
What might their motivations be?
Yeah.
Do they have evidence to support their claims?
So being more of an active reader or viewer, not just, letting the information wash over us,
Yeah,
but really engaging with it.
exactly. And, along those lines, pay attention to the language that's being used.
Okay.
Is it sensationalized or emotionally charged? Does it seem designed to provoke a strong reaction? Those can be signs that the information is being presented in a, manipulative or biased way.
It's like, being aware of the techniques that advertisers use to get us to buy things.
Exactly.
We need to be just as savvy when it comes to news.
And remember, developing these critical thinking skills takes time and practice.
Sure.
It's not something that happens overnight, but the more you do it, the better you'll get at, discerning credible information from misinformation.
So it's a process. It's
Yeah.
ongoing.
Absolutely. And it's a journey worth taking because,
Yeah.
being informed and discerning citizens is more important now than ever
Definitely.
in our interconnected world.
I feel like this deep dive has really given me a lot to think about. I know it's made me more aware of my own biases and how important it is to, look at things from lots of different angles.
Me too.
And this conversation also reminded me that fake news isn't just about like crazy stories or outright lies.
Yeah.
It can be a lot more subtle than that, which I think makes it even harder to spot.
It's often about the way information is framed, the facts that are chosen or left out.
Right.
That's why it's so important to really develop those critical thinking skills
Yeah.
and, engage with information actively, not passively.
So for our listeners out there, we'll leave you with this. How can you promote a more informed and responsible approach to news in your own life and in your community?
Yeah.
What steps can you take to foster critical thinking and, have civil discourse even when you disagree with people?
Those are questions worth thinking about as we navigate, this world of news and information.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.